Potatoes are one of the most popular and versatile crops in the garden. They can be used for so many different things. So if you haven't been able to tell by the title of this video, we're going to be going over all of the different methods, techniques, and ways to get your potatoes ready and planted for a successful potato harvest. Potatoes, like I mentioned, can be used for so many different types of things, from baked potatoes to fries to just used for their very high starch properties. Now, potatoes are in the nightshade family, meaning they are relatives of tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. And this is particularly important because just like tomatoes, potatoes can be broken up into two different categories: indeterminate varieties and determinate varieties. Now, determinate varieties are potatoes that generally mature much quicker. Somewhere in the 60 to 75 day range is rather common, but the only downside to these is that they often produce a smaller harvest, and the potatoes are often smaller themselves as well. And this is because when a determinate variety starts setting its potatoes, it sets them all in one row underneath the ground, whereas if you're growing an indeterminate variety, they will produce multiple layers underneath the ground of potatoes. So think about it this way: when a potato starts to set its fruit or its vegetable, it will produce one layer and then it'll keep growing above the soil. And that's when mounding comes into place. Sometimes you'll hear mounding the soil, which we'll talk about later in this video. But that's to keep covering up the plant as it grows. That plant will continue to put out roots, which will continue to put out multiple layers of potatoes. So with this, indeterminate varieties usually produce a much larger yield, larger potatoes in general, but they do take longer to mature. Anywhere from 75 days on is more common with indeterminate varieties. So when you're choosing a variety, just look at whether it's indeterminate or determinate, just like you would do with tomatoes, just to see if you can grow it in your area. If you are in a climate that does not have as many growing days, determinate varieties would probably be best for you due to their lower growing date. They don't take as long to mature, and it's just a better option for colder climates. Now, the next thing is just going off the overall taste and the use of the potato based on the variety. There are so many different types of varieties out there, so if you are growing potatoes, you really want to make sure that you are reading the description, reading what type of potato it is and what it can be used for. For example, russet potatoes, they are much higher in starch content, so they are better for making things like fries or cooking. Whereas if you wanted something for, let's say, raw consumption or putting in soups or something of that sort, something like red Pontiac or Yukon Gold are good options for that. So when you are deciding to grow potatoes, make sure you're reading what the potato is good for, how much starch it has, all of those different things that make up the potato, and then go based on that. Now, of course, to grow new potatoes in the garden, you're going to need to start with existing potatoes. This step is super important, and that's choosing the right potatoes to grow. You really want to make sure that you're getting potatoes from a seed potato farm or a seed company, or just a place that was specifically designed, or a place that specifically cultivated these potatoes for the use of growing new existing potatoes in the garden. It's totally fine if you decide to grow store-bought potatoes, but oftentimes these potatoes contain pesticides, or they're sprayed with some type of growth inhibitor to prevent them from sprouting. Now, if you don't want any of that in your garden, any of those chemicals or other things that can come with store-bought potatoes, like diseases, for example, choosing potatoes that were specifically cultivated as seed potatoes is your best bet. So how do we get a normal potato to produce multiple potatoes in the garden? Well, this all starts with a process called chitting. Now, chitting your potato probably has already happened to you and you don't even know it. Oftentimes when we buy our bags of potatoes at the store, we bring them home and we let them sit before we use them for a couple weeks. They start producing these disgusting looking alien things off of the potato, and most often, or most people would just throw them in the trash because, I mean, who would eat that? But in the gardener's world, this is actually what we're looking for. Now, the reason that we want this is because this takes off probably 4 to 6 weeks of your growing date. So you could just theoretically place this potato before it started producing much into the ground, and it will produce a nice large crop of potatoes. But if you're in a colder climate or a climate with less growing days, you really want to chit your potatoes beforehand. So to do this, like I said, you put them in a breathable bag or even the pantry, just somewhere that allows these potatoes to get a little bit of light so that it will trigger them to start sprouting. Now, after about, I'd say 3 to 5 weeks, you will have 1 to 2 inch sprouts coming off the potato. Now, this is perfect for planting. After that point, you can basically just take the potato, dig a hole, and put it right in the ground. It's pretty much as simple as that. But occasionally, you will get these larger potatoes that are producing so many different shoots off of the one potato. And this can become problematic because all of these shoots are going to be fighting for nutrients, and they're not going to produce as large of a harvest because they're all packed right here in this one spot. So to solve this problem, you can actually take the potato, and like I've done here, that was a larger one, you can cut it into smaller shoots or smaller pieces. On here, there's still a lot of shoots on this cut piece. In a single potato, depending on how many shoots, you could do this 2, 3, 4 times, or occasionally even more. I recommend sticking with 2 to 3 pieces per potato because all of the nutrients are in this potato to get these things to actually sprout and get healthy and on the right track. You really want to give these sprouts as much of the potato as you can. So if you are cutting these into a million different pieces, there's not going to be a lot of nutrients in that potato for the plant to keep thriving in its earliest stages of life. So keeping a good sized chunk with the sprouts intact is generally recommended. Now when you are cutting the potato, before you go to plant, you don't want to just stick these in the ground after you've just freshly cut them. When you're doing this, a lot of times the potatoes can actually start to rot on this side. You can actually see here there's a little bit of mold and stuff forming there because I've cut it. And if you just stick this right in the ground, they, like I said, are just going to rot or they're going to sometimes cause a lot of unneeded issues. So after you cut them, you want to leave them indoors in a warmer area. I'd say probably 60 to 70 degrees is good for them. But you don't want to give them a lot of moisture that would come in the soil. So leaving them out for, I'd say 1 to 3 days before you go to plant, somewhere in the house to allow these cut pieces to scab over and form a protective layer over that fresh raw skin. That will really further prevent the chances of them rotting or of diseases and other things setting in. And it's just something that I do and something that I would recommend you do too, to just avoid that problem. Now, one question I've been asked is what happens if the sprouts on the potato get too large? Generally, you want to avoid this if you can. You really want to make sure, like we talked about, that the sprouts are only about 1 to 2 inches. But if they do get too large, it's in reality really not a problem at all. If you look on the potato, a lot of times you'll see new sprouts coming out. So if this larger one or larger ones do die off, you have those smaller ones to make up for it. All right, now that we've went over the whole process of getting these potatoes prepped for the garden, let's go outside and get these planted. All right, now when it comes to planting potatoes, there is one thing that you should note, and that is when we should actually get the potatoes in the ground. Now, potatoes are actually cold hardy to an extent. And what I mean by that is when we plant the potatoes in the ground, those roots or those tubers or the potato itself, those are cold hardy. So those, if a light frost comes, they're underground, they're safe, they're not really going to get too damaged. But if the sprouts start to appear above the soil when frost is still around, those will sometimes die back. They will get damaged. So it's important to time when we're planting them in the sense that once they're underneath ground, we want those sprouts to start appearing once the chances of frost have passed, or are at least very unlikely. So when saying that, potatoes can be planted really as soon as the soil can be worked. So like I said, potatoes are cold hardy. They actually prefer the cold weather. They don't like super extensive heat. But if you do plant these and the cold weather does continue to linger later on into the season, it's gonna be fine. They will just kind of go dormant in the soil until the warmer weather arrives, and then they will start to sprout. Now, when we're planting these, you want to plant them at a depth of, I'd say, 8 inches, at least somewhere in between 6, 8 to 10 inches is really perfect. You want them deep enough to where if you do get a hard frost, they're not going to get damaged. They're going to be protected underneath the soil. But this really generally does work best somewhere in that depth range. Works perfectly fine. So when we're planting these, again, we're just going to put it at about 8 to 10 inches and then just cover. Fertilizing at the start really does not matter too much. Like I said earlier in this video, the potato contains all of the nutrients the plant needs for a good amount of its life. Until it really starts to set a lot of its roots and starts to produce those potatoes, it's going to suck all of the nutrients out of that seed potato and use that to continue to grow. So really every, I'd say, 4 to 6 weeks, you can give it a douse of some type of nutrient-rich fertilizer. You really want to avoid giving it a high nitrogen fertilizer, because a lot of times those are just going to go towards the plants and not towards the root. Phosphorus, that's super important when it comes to any type of root crop, because that's what's really developing root systems. And because we're talking about potatoes, it all has to do with the roots. Now, potatoes, like I said, do prefer raised beds or fabric pots or something that you can personally fill with a well-draining, loose soil. Because those developing potatoes underground are developing in a looser soil, they often get much larger than they would in, for example, a clay type soil or something that just gets compacted. Because if you're growing potatoes in a very compacted soil, the roots can't expand easily. Those potatoes can't grow to the largest size possibly easily. And in return, you're just not going to get as large of potatoes and as large of a harvest. But with saying that, you can most definitely grow in ground. So many people do it. I'm actually going to be doing it right now. But when you're growing in ground, it's important that you mix whatever soil you have with compost. Now, compost not only adds aeration and loosens the soil up, but it also adds that fertility and the nutrients that the potatoes can definitely use. But other than that, potatoes are super forgiving. It's a super easy crop to grow. And for space-wise, growing in ground is often the best option. All right, so like I said, potatoes are super forgiving. And I say that especially when it comes to planting in ground. A lot of times if you're in an area that has a very high clay soil type, you're never going to be able to get it exactly smooth and perfect unless you're bringing in tons of compost and other loose soil, and which sometimes does get very expensive. So it's okay if your soil is a little bit compacted. Your potatoes are going to do just fine. You may experience a little bit less of a harvest or smaller potatoes overall, but because we're planting in ground, we can really fit multiple or a lot more potatoes in one smaller area. One thing that I will say when planting in ground is indeterminate varieties usually do better when it comes to this. They're much easier to mount. Like we talked about earlier, indeterminate varieties will continue to get taller and taller, and they will send out new side roots that will create layers of potatoes, meaning that you're going to get a much larger harvest. Now, mounding is not necessarily easy when it comes to growing in fabric pots or raised beds, because you only have so much room. So you can actually plant these potatoes deeper. I'd say maybe 8 to 10 inches is totally fine underground. And then when you plant that, as the stems or as the leaf growth gets taller and taller, mounding it as it grows will give you a much larger harvest. So indeterminate varieties really do work best when it comes to growing potatoes in ground. So that's just something I recommend, but determinate varieties do work perfectly fine as well. So I just wanted to go over in-ground growing. It's the same exact thing pretty much as growing in raised beds, but I just wanted to cover that it is totally normal and it's super easy. You can fit a lot more in a single space than you can raised beds or fabric pots. But potatoes in ground sometimes is really the best bet to go for most people. So one option here, raised beds work great. Potatoes are super forgiving, super easy to grow. And I mean, you can try all of them, see what works best for you, but in ground does work great. All right, and that's it when it comes to getting your potatoes prepped and planted. We'll have a lot more content throughout the growing season as these potatoes grow on our farm coming out. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of that. And if any of these varieties that we talked about interest you, we will actually have a lot of them available come 2025. So if they interest you at all, or if you want to grow them, make sure that you either reach out to us or that you continually check out our seed shop later this season so that you can get your hands on some of these varieties. Thank you so much for watching, and if you learned something new, please give it a like. And if you have any questions at all, drop them in the comment section below and I'll do my best and try to answer all of them. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.